So in the last two videos, we've been talking about social epistemology. And we saw that one of the things that social epistemologists are doing is that they are thinking about the relations between people. And one of the things that they're doing is that they're trying to make the specific person that we talk about in epistemology a bit more concrete, right? Rather than talking about as if they are some ahistorical, asocial subject, they are trying to understand what happens to knowledge, or what the relevance to knowledge is of the fact that S is always going to be a concrete person in a concrete society at a concrete time of history and in a concrete role in that society. And I don't think it's surprising at all that social epistemology has been strengthened immeasurably by feminist epistemology. So feminist thinkers working in epistemology have always emphasized the idea that you can't understand the knower sort of in abstraction. They're part of a society. And the way that that society treats them, the way that that society views them, the way that they maybe view themselves as part of that society is going to be relevant. And it's going to be relevant for that person themselves. It's also going to be relevant for epistemic communities. So for instance, as scientists, as a scientific community, we would have to think about, for instance, the point and purpose of equality, right? I mean, I suppose that it's fairly easy to agree that men and women should have equal access to scientific careers as a sort of ethical point. Right? I mean, whether you're a man or a woman, it shouldn't matter. I mean, you should be able to get into a scientific career if you have the desire and the talent. At least there should be an equality of opportunity there. So that would be an ethical point. But epistemologists, and in this case in particular feminist epistemologists, have also thought long and hard about whether there's an epistemic benefit to this. Right? What happens when you open up a traditionally male group, such as that of scientists, to women? Is it going to only be a win, like an ethical win, that okay, now women also have this freedom to do this career, or is it also going to be an epistemic win, where in fact, maybe in all sciences, or maybe only in certain sciences, or maybe in, some other subdivision of science, there's going to be an epistemic improvement. And it's fairly easy actually to point out sciences where there was an epistemic improvement, and some of them are also fairly unsurprising. So for instance, in women's medicine, yeah, it kind of helps if some of the medical researchers are women. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, of course. I don't think it's very controversial, but it's something that, people didn't actually immediately accept. Right? If you have a particular view of how the scientific method works, where you think that, you just follow the method and then you get the right results, and following the method has nothing to do with who you are, if that's the way that you view things, then you might be surprised by this kind of effect, where it actually does seem to matter who does the science. Now, one way of working this out, or rather one particular idea that you could focus on and that you could then work out, is the idea focused on by that part of epistemology that is known as standpoint epistemology. And so that's the topic of this particular video. I'm going to talk about this one part of social epistemology, which is also a part of feminist epistemology, which is called standpoint epistemology. And this is a part of epistemology that really takes the relationship between epistemology on the one hand and social and political thinking on the other hand very, very seriously. And I think it's very interesting for us to see how that might work and what kind of lessons we might draw from that. So here is the basic idea, or what I will take to be the basic idea of standpoint epistemology. And as with so many terms in philosophy, different people have different definitions of it. This is going to be the way that I'll talk about in this video. So in this video, standpoint epistemology is going to be the claim that marginalized social groups may have epistemically privileged standpoints. So marginalized groups in society, so people who are not at all in the elite, people whose voices are maybe less heard, who are less influential, may have, I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the may have later on, epistemically privileged standpoints. So what does that mean? Well, I want to say something about standpoint first, and then I'm going to give you some concrete examples, and then we're going to work all of this out in more theoretical detail. So standpoint first. So clearly, I would say, it's true in almost all societies that non-marginalized groups, and especially the elite, have an epistemically privileged position in some sense, namely in the sense that they have more access to education. Right? If you have more access to education, there's more stuff that you can learn. That's in some sense an epistemically privileged position. Right? So if I have the money to study mathematics, I can get more mathematical knowledge than somebody who doesn't have that money. Okay, and that means that I have an epistemic privilege when it comes to learning more about mathematics. But really, my role in society and knowledge of mathematics has nothing to do with each other. Right? They're completely external to each other. Well, that's not what standpoint theorists are talking about. But when we talk about standpoints here, what we mean is that there is certain knowledge that I can have more easily precisely because I occupy this particular role, this particular point in society. So the knowledge itself has to have something to do with the very standpoint in society, with the very place in society that I have. So we're not talking about something like access to education, where what you learn in education is completely neutral with respect to where you are in society. Okay, so with that out of the way, I think it's going to be really a lot easier to understand what we're talking about if we give some concrete examples. So my first concrete example is actually an idea that predates what we tend to call standpoint theory, because it's an idea that was developed by Marxist philosophers earlier in the 20th century. I don't think you find this in Marx himself. I'm not entirely certain. I know that it's developed by Marxist philosophers in the 20th century. And the idea would be that, like, working class people in a capitalist society actually have a better chance of understanding and knowing what the social structure is really like. In particular, working class people who, of course, according to the Marxist analysis, are oppressed by a capitalist class who owns the means of production, it's really only they who can understand the nature of this oppression, and maybe even who can know the fact that this oppression is taking place. And here the idea would be this, right? If I'm this working class person, I experience this oppression all the time, and I can see it for what it is, right? I can see it for the oppression that it is because of the way that I experience it, right? I know that I really don't have any choice. I mean, I have to submit myself to this system. I have to submit to this alienating labor, the fruits of which go to the rich owner of the factory, and so on. Whereas, on the other hand, the capitalist very, very probably doesn't know what they're doing. They don't really know that they are oppressing people. Right? They probably know what they think is that, I give them work. I pay them enough to live. I don't force them to work here. I mean, they come here of their own. They ask me for a job. I give them a job. They can go away whenever they want to. I mean, I'm not chaining them up or something like that. I'm just giving opportunities to people. I mean, that might be the way that the factory owner thinks about themselves. And according to this Marxist analysis, they're wrong, and it's sort of kind of false consciousness, right? I mean, they're thinking about this from their own perspective in a sort of twisted way that allows them, or that almost makes it impossible for them. That's what I should say. That makes it impossible for them to see the true meaning of the system that they themselves seem to control. So the idea here would be that if you are at the bottom of this social ladder, like the very fact of being at the bottom of this social ladder allows you to see more clearly how the society is structured and what's really going on than being at the top of the social structure. There's nothing inevitable about any of that, right? It's not the claim that everybody at the bottom of society knows exactly what's going on, right? I mean, maybe you really have to think about it. Maybe you have to talk with other people in order to find out and in order to get the right concepts and so on. Also, no claim that nobody at the top of society can understand what's going on. Although probably it would be easiest for them to come to that understanding by talking to, like, the workers, right? It's going to be very hard for them to work this out from their own privileged position. So the claim is not that there's some sort of incommensurability here, that people can't understand each other, but the claim is that depending on where you are in society, the true nature of that society might be more obvious to you, or less obvious to you. So here are some other things that I'm not going to discuss all of these in detail, but some other examples that a standpoint theorist might bring in. So for instance, if you belong to a social group that is the target of a particular kind of injustice, you probably know more, you're in a better position to know something about it. In part because you may have experienced it yourself, but also because you can understand way better what it is to experience it and how people would react when they experience it and how often it happens and what counts as this kind of injustice and what doesn't, and so on. So, for instance, it makes a lot of sense in our current society to think that women have an easier time understanding certain kinds of sexual assault than men, because it happens to them more often. They know from experience how society treats women. They know from experience all kinds of things that are far less accessible to someone like me. Although, of course, I can talk to them or read what they write, right? And then I can come to maybe know that too. Again, we're not claiming that there's some kind of incommensurability or impossibility to understand. We're claiming that certain groups in society have a privileged access. We're not claiming that they can't communicate what they know to other groups. So women probably have an easier time understanding certain types of sexual harassment and sexual assault in society. Black people probably have an easier time understanding the racism in society, right? Where exactly does it happen? What forms does it take? Probably a lot easier to know if you are the one on the receiving end than if you are, sort of cruising along in society and don't really get confronted with it so much. Here's an example that I find kind of interesting, and it's a little bit more concrete, and maybe that also makes it a little bit more interesting to talk about. So one thing that you might wonder about in different types of societies, both richer ones and poorer ones in the world, is why kids drop out of education. Right? Maybe why are they truant, or why do they drop out of education altogether? And there's a lot of reasons for that, of course. But here is one reason that I had never ever thought about, but that seems to be in certain places, in certain societies, and in certain groups of society, fairly important. I mean, this makes a real difference to actual numbers of school attendance and how many people continue their schooling. It has to do with the availability of menstrual pads, right? If you are a girl and you get to the age where you start menstruating and you don't have anything to sort of wear to make sure that you comfortably get through your day, then that's a pretty good reason to not go to school. I mean, you can't really go to school if you might leave, bodily fluids everywhere. I mean, you're not going to do that, right? And so it turns out that both in poorer societies, where things like menstrual pads might be unavailable to large classes of society, well, what you see is that at the age of puberty, the number of girls going to school starts dropping. And it's, one, or not the only cause, but one of the causes is that girls, they have to miss school a couple of days a month. And if they have to miss school a couple of days a month, they get behind, it becomes harder for them to do it. And of course, some of them will persevere, but some of them won't, and they will have to drop out. But of course, this also happens in richer societies, right? If you're in a poorer section of society and you can't actually afford these things, that might be a reason to not go to school. That might get you into trouble with school. It's not clear that you're going to tell them the truth, right? I mean, it's not something that you might want to talk about. And so it turns out that one of the ways in which, even in a first world country, you can reduce truancy, but especially, of course, in poorer countries, you can increase the number of girls that continue education, is to give them free sanitary pads, right? To put those in the school bathroom or to just give them to people. And if you had asked me to sit down and think up some measures to improve the education of girls or to keep down truancy numbers, this is something I would have never thought up in a million years, right? It would not have occurred to me that this could be a cause of people missing school on a regular basis. If you'd asked it to a woman, who knows, maybe. If you'd asked it to a poor man, who knows, maybe, but probably you only get this insight if you ask it to somebody who is both a woman and has known poverty, right? Because that's the combination of factors that makes this type of situation a lived reality for you, which you can connect imaginatively to not attending school. And so, of course, having heard about it, I understand it, right? It's obvious. I understand why there actually are charities doing the work of handing out these menstrual pads to girls, and it makes a lot of sense. And I understand why there are schools who put them in their school bathrooms, and it makes a lot of sense. But I would never have thought that up, right? And so it turns out that something that at first sight it seems I could have investigated as well as anyone else, namely school attendance numbers, truancy, education, what kind of measures can we put into place in order to keep people in school longer? I mean, why wouldn't I be able to investigate that? Well, I am able to investigate that, I suppose, and I would be better able if I had not been a philosopher but a social scientist. But I'm able to investigate that, sure, but I definitely needed input from other people. And in particular, I needed input from the people who are the ones getting into trouble, right? Who are the ones maybe potentially dropping out of school, who are the ones running into difficulties that I, from my perspective, wasn't seeing. Well, that's the type of example that standpoint theorists are very interested in. It's the type of example where we seem to have, at first sight maybe, a relatively neutral question, right? How to improve school truancy and dropout numbers. Okay, but it turns out that in order to get to the good interventions, in order to get the right knowledge about this, what we really need is the input of the people who are most at risk, right? Who are in the most difficult situation here and who are most at risk of, dropping out. So, having given you a few concrete examples, let's go back to this claim that I said is the claim of standpoint epistemology. And so the claim of standpoint epistemology is that marginalized social groups may have epistemically privileged standpoints. May have is super important, right? It's super important in the first instance because it obviously depends on the topic, right? It's not the case that poor people or women or black people or whatever marginalized group in society I'm going to talk about are going to have privileged insight into number theory. No, I mean, nobody's social position is going to give them privileged insight into number theory, right? Into the existence of infinitely many twin primes or whatever, because it has nothing to do with your social standpoint, right? So the claim is the may have, one of the elements of the may have here is that, of course, a marginalized social group is going to have a privileged epistemic standpoint only when it comes to viewing things that have to do with themselves and their marginalized status, right? That's one important thing to understand. The second important thing that's here in the may have is that this privilege, this epistemic privilege, is not automatic, right? It's not the case that, like, the oppressed Marxist worker, well, the not yet Marxist worker, so the oppressed worker automatically has a very good insight into the structure of society. No, but they might be in a better position to get it, right? If they do the work, if they talk to other people. It's not the case that women have always understood that they were oppressed in a patriarchal society, right? I mean, very often they didn't understand that, right? They thought that it was natural, that it was the logical situation. But they might be in a better situation to get to that understanding, right? And then tell the rest of us about it, teach the rest of us about it. So the may have, this privileged epistemic standpoint will have to be achieved, right? It might take work. It might take a lot of work. It might take work even not as an individual, but as a group. So that's also something. When we say that marginalized social groups may have this privileged epistemic standpoint, we're really talking about the group, right? We're not claiming that every individual member of the group has this privileged standpoint. It's more like if they work together, if they start comparing their experiences, if they start thinking, that's when the epistemic privilege might really get started. So, how obvious is the truth of standpoint theory? This is not a question I ask a lot in philosophy, but one of the criticisms that people have sometimes of standpoint theory, well, one criticism is that it's clearly false, but another criticism is that it's clearly true, right? It's so true that, who cares? Is this even a philosophical point? Of course, people in one position in society have more knowledge about that position in society. But it's actually not so obvious. And in fact, what the standpoint theorists are telling us runs counter to two, I would say, fairly strong strands of thought that also exist in our society. One strand of thought is a particular way of thinking about science. It's thinking about science as being objective in the sense of a completely value neutral and background neutral following of a method. Right? And so the idea would be that as a scientist, well, I just follow the scientific method. That's how I get my scientific results. That's it. Right? Who I am as a scientist, that doesn't matter. Well, there's something true about that. Right? You can't defend a scientific claim by saying, well, look, I am this and this person, and therefore you have to believe me, or therefore this is true. That's not how science works. But on the other hand, science is not a method in the sense of a recipe that you follow, and everybody just follows the recipe and you get the result. You've got to decide a lot of things. What are you going to research? How are you going to research it? In those choices, your background can play a very important role. You take me, you ask me to find out about truancy. I think, what could cause truancy? What could cause truancy? Well, maybe those kids are bored at school, right? Maybe they're highly intelligent, they're bored at school, that's why they drop out. That's what I'm going to investigate. That's the kind of thing that I might come up with. And it's a good thing to investigate. A lot of people who are high functioning, very intelligent, get bored at school, drop out. Great. But it's not the only thing that we ought to be investigating. And again, not in a million years would I have thought about investigating menstruation and poverty. And how those things interact with each other. So we need people with different backgrounds coming in to get the ideas on the table, right? To understand what might be going on. Maybe even to approach people in particular ways, right? You might know better how to get into contact with certain people in society, depending on where your own background in society is, and so on. So there's a certain vision of scientific neutrality or objectivity, like where science is just impersonal rule following, that doesn't work. At least the standpoint theorist will tell us it doesn't work, and I think they would be right. It doesn't seem to work. Here's something else, and it's a little bit more out there, but I think it's very interesting to make this connection. Standpoint theory is really, in a sense, the opposite of conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories tend to have the following structure, right? They tend to say, well, there's this elite, and this elite has decided what the world ought to be like. And they have superior knowledge and superior power, and they keep us all in thrall by making their vision of society the correct one. And so according to that type of conspiracy theory, the elite, who might be, of course, completely invisible, right? They might not be the people we think of as the elite, but the real elite are epistemically privileged. They know exactly what's going on in society. They understand what society is like. And everybody else is held in ignorance, right? We don't understand what's going on. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what standpoint theory suggests, one could say. Right? Standpoint theory suggests that in many cases it's actually those who are the oppressed or the victims or the marginalized or the less influential parts of society. Of course, there can be different strengths of badness here. They might know better what's going on in society than those at the top. Right? Those at the top might actually be in a kind of bad position to understand what's going on. So they need to listen to the people who are not at the top in order to understand what society is really like and how it could be changed and improved. And for my money, I think that makes a lot more sense. Right? If you listen to what people say about society, it does not necessarily seem to be the case that people in power have better insight. And of course, a conspiracy theorist might say, well, they have better insight, but they hide it. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot here, I think, that one can understand in terms of people not really understanding what's going on, not really understanding the experiences of other groups in society. That explains a lot of how people act, of how people structure society. And so I think that, one of the things that standpoint theory does is it gives us a nice handle on that. It also gives us a kind of story about what we ought to do, right? Because what we ought to do is, well, we ought to talk to each other. But in particular, what we ought to do is we ought to strive as epistemic communities, we ought to strive for a particular kind of epistemic diversity. Okay, what kind of epistemic diversity? Well, the standpoint theorist is going to say that, of course, it all depends on the questions that we're asking, right? I mean, if we are doing number theory, right, then what kind of epistemic diversity do we need? Well, look, there's just ethical considerations, right? I mean, you just got to make sure, it's not easy, but you just got to make sure that everybody has equal access, equal opportunity of becoming a number theorist, but then it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter what your social background is for doing number theory, probably. Okay, but now we're thinking about more concrete things, right? Now we're thinking about things like, what about, studying education? Or what about studying economics? Or what about studying medicine? Okay, now suddenly we're talking about people, right? And we are asking questions and looking at policy problems that involve actual real people. And now what the standpoint theorist is going to say is they're going to say, look, what you need for good knowledge is you need not just like diversity, but you need a particular kind of diversity. Specifically, what you need to do is you need to bring people into your epistemic community from these marginalized communities that are impacted by the kinds of things that you are researching. Why? Why is bringing in these marginalized communities especially important? Well, because they've got these privileged insights, right? What's privileged about them? Well, one thing that's privileged about them is it's about them, right? I mean, they are the people who run into this kind of trouble that these policies have to solve. So it's these people that you need to talk to if you want to know what the problems really are, which problems exist, how to understand them, what kind of solutions might work. So that's one element of privilege. Another element, somewhat connected to it, but maybe a little bit more general, is that these insights have the ideas that might be specific for these more marginalized groups in society. They have a higher probability of being new, in the sense that the insights that are current in the more dominant groups of society are probably already there in the science, because these people have been scientists for a longer time. So it's probably the case that people from groups that have had less access to science until now, there's just more probability that they bring new and fresh ways of looking at things into the picture. So that's at least two reasons to sort of strive for that particular kind of epistemic diversity, where we try to get those people on board who are, let's say, who are on the one hand sort of connected to the topic of research, but on the other hand have had less access to the science, have in that sense been more marginalized. Now, what does it mean to bring them into the epistemic community? I mean, it doesn't just mean giving them a PhD, right? It means actually getting into discussion with them, right? We need to talk to people. We need all to talk to people. Like, everybody needs to be eager to learn from each other. Only if we do that can we also learn from these maybe newer voices and their criticisms. And of course, it doesn't mean that they are automatically right. You know, if you're a woman, that doesn't mean that you're automatically right about women's medicine. But it might be the case that you bring in some new insights or perspectives. And the way to find out is to do what we always do or ought to do, which is discuss it, talk about it, do more research, take everybody's ideas seriously, but also seriously, of course, for criticism. And when we do this, the actual epistemic benefits, right, the actual knowledge that we gain, will not be knowledge that is gained by only this marginalized group or something like that. No, the knowledge will be gained by the entire epistemic community. So really what we're trying to do is working together, right? I mean, we're trying to get these other points of view on board to strengthen the community as a whole. So that's something that I want to once again emphasize, because it's so important, and if you misunderstand this, then you haven't understood standpoint epistemology at all. In fact, I would say you've turned it into its demonic opposite. The absolutely crucial point is that these standpoints are not isolated, they're not islands, they're not insular. It's not that, oh, there's the people here who can understand this thing and there's the people there who can understand that other thing. No, the picture is that you bring people with these different points of view, and of course especially the people whose point of view might be especially relevant and especially unknown because they haven't been heard much. You bring them into the conversation, right, into the epistemic community, and you work together and learn together to get more insight into society and hopefully change it for the better. Okay, so that's what standpoint epistemology has been telling us. And there's a lot about that makes sense, right? And I would say that it's not trivial because there are obviously ways of thinking about science, ways of thinking about society, which are inconsistent with this. But I mean, sometimes I've also read things where people are sort of they have really weird understandings of feminist epistemology in general and of standpoint epistemology in particular, that have nothing to do with reality, right, with the real theories. And so I hope that this video has been clarifying about that, and that we can all learn from it.